So welcome to the Supply Chain Insights webinar series. I am your host, Constance Coral, and today's topic is Voice of the Supply Chain Leader, which is also the title of our recent research report, which can be found on our website. Our presenter today is Lora Cecere, founder and CEO of Supply Chain Insights. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few details. This webinar will be recorded and will be available shortly to view on demand. Today's webinar deck will be available on SlideShare, and I will be providing that link in the chat window momentarily. We want to hear from you, so please participate and ask questions in the Q&A section. We will compile as we go and get to as many as we can towards the end of the presentation. Today's Twitter hashtag is SCI Webinar. So please go ahead and tweet out nuggets of information in the social networks. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Lora Cecere.
Awesome. Constance, thank you very much for the introduction. And as I had talked to you earlier, I'm going to need you to drive the slides for me today. So welcome to the team, and we're so glad to have you. This particular presentation is going to combine a number of studies that we've been doing, and Constance has communicated correctly that we will be sharing this on SlideShare, but we will also be giving the full reports for all of these studies in our newsletter, and you can find them on our website as well. So we've done a couple of studies, and in each study what I'll do is I'll go through the demographics and I'll go through the role of the study. And so we have an agenda. We're going to talk about where we are on EDI. We're going to talk a little bit about supply chain visibility and business networks, and we're also going to talk about voice of supply chain leaders on current software. We'll spend most of our time on this third topic, the voice of supply chain leaders on current software. So, first of all, EDI on slide 3, where, people say they want to build the end-to-end supply chain, but often I go into work sessions where people will say they want to build end-to-end, but really what they're talking about is the automation of the enterprise. And when we look at the automation of the enterprise on the next slide, what we find is that EDI is over 40 years old, and we wanted to know where are we on hands-free orders and hands-free purchase orders, and what is the value proposition for the transactional automation of the value network. So we set up this study to figure out where are we on automation today of value network so that when people talk to us about end-to-end, we could talk to them about where we are today. And so this particular study says that, EDI is the workhorse of the extended supply chain. Today, about 50% of orders move through EDI, but only about a third of them move through hands-free. And in fact, often I will share this data and people will say, wow, we wish that we were that good. And we find that hands-free sales orders move twice as fast when they're actually able to be automated. And so there's latency associated with not being able to move the orders hands-free. So if we skip to slide 7, where we've got the actual demographics of this, we find that, we had 79 manufacturers, retailers, distributors, and they were fairly large companies. These were people that were knowledgeable about EDI. And when we go into the actual data, what we find on slide 14 is that the percentage of orders exchanged by each B2B method, that 34% of them will flow through with no manual intervention, 21% with minimal, and then we've got this red area where we call multi-party trading exchanges, and that's about 7% of business flows. But if we look at the purchase order period of where are we actually on procurement, you can see that 1% of the orders are actually flowing through on multi-party trading exchanges. So we have really focused on the automation of the enterprise, not necessarily the building of end-to-end. And where we have built end-to-end, what we're really doing is we're moving transactions through data standards via EDI. And then the rest of the data basically looks at the latency, which is slide 15, which says that If the orders cannot move through without hands, we actually have a very different amount of time to process the orders. And then we get into what is the challenge, which is looking at, why do we want to do this? And so, if we don't do it, then it's more time consuming and it's harder to reconcile invoices and receipts. So with that kind of as a background in terms of some of the research that we've been doing on EDI, what I want to do is skip into the voice of the supply chain. So Constance, if we could go into the deck to slide 48. What I want to do now is spend quite a bit of time on the study that's called Voice of the Supply Chain. And this is an annual study that we do every year. And what we do in this study is we are actually looking for what is the state of the supply chain and how satisfied our line of business users on the use of supply chain software. So on slide 50, what we have are the demographics of the current state, what we were trying to survey against. We were trying to look at supply chain excellence, the pain points, the areas of focus. We had 96 completes, and we did this study recently, December 2013 to February 2014. Now, nearly 3/4 of the respondents on the next slide say they work for a manufacturer. So when you look at this Voice of the Supply Chain study, you should really think about large manufacturers. And in fact, in the next slide, you can see that they were $4 billion in revenue and they had 28,000 employees. So these are very large companies, and this is typically the kind of demographics that we're dealing with in the studies that we're publishing for Supply Chain Insights. And just let me add, before we get the question, all of the data that we're sharing is available. We share freely, and so feel free to share it. You can pick up the slides and actually use them in your presentations, no problem. And at the bottom of each of the slides, we have, the fact that it was done by Supply Chain Insights and the period, and it also has the demographics and the questions. So, if you forget kind of the flow after, the session, you can go back and you can very quickly understand these slides. So we're on the demographics, and so it was respondent companies with average revenue greater than $4 billion, 28,000 companies. And on the next slide, on slide 53, what we can see is that these people work in different industries. In fact, it's spread across many industries, and about 50% of them were discrete, and then it was a combination of process and retail. Now on the next slide, which is slide 54, we found that 60% of the respondents were director level or higher. And so this particular study represents supply chain leaders that are at a very high level. And then on slide 55, just for reference, we have the definition of the supply chain. In other words, how did these people define supply chain? Because every company will define it a little bit differently, but on average they had 5 functions, and most of them are starting to report higher up in the organization to the CEO, the Chief Operating Officer, the President, and so we're seeing that the reporting relationships are increasing in the company. Okay, so let's get into the data. On slide 57, what we find is what are the top areas of supply chain pain? And we actually found that the executive level of understanding of supply chain, which is often how do the supply chains deliver corporate performance, and the tension between the functional areas of the supply chain and a more end-to-end or cross-functional view. People are really struggling with how do I make trade-offs, what is the role of the function, what is the role of horizontal processes, and you often will see this in all the change management issues you see in sales and operations planning or supplier development or corporate social responsibility. So the executive level of understanding of the supply chain is a major issue and should be on one of the top agenda items of the supply chain team to help the executive team understand the supply chain as a complex system. The second highest area, which is huge for most companies, is the ability to get the right data. Companies have a lot of systems, but their ability to get the right data is a challenge. And then the next one is actionable analytics, which people want to be able to really move the data into actionable analytics. And one of the issues that we find is that often when people are thinking about analytics projects, they think about them a lot like we thought about traditional ERP of a big as-is and to-be and, project rollout. But on actionable analytics, we find that the most successful companies are doing experimentation, and they, trial small, and they start and they learn, and it's about a series of small trials. So as we move from big implementations of big, large ERP into small analytics projects, one of the things that's happening is we've got to really change our mental models. We've got to educate executives, and we've also got to look at the state of the supply chain. So on the next slide, which is slide 58, what we asked was, what are the greatest improvements, or what's positive about the supply chain? And you can see that people feel that, we've made it global, which was a huge undertaking in the last decade. And we've also modernized it. In fact, we would not have been able to build global supply chains without ERP. And it provides a great system of record for transactions. But when we ask, what are the improvement areas, or where do we really need to focus on the next slide, what we find is that we're in functional silos. And in fact, one of the issues is that career paths move through functional silos, processes move through functional silos, metrics are very silo-oriented, and they're very reactive. And so what's happened in the last 5 years is our silos have become, deeper. And in fact, the supply chain has become a silo all to itself. So as we look at the technologies and we look at how well people are using technologies and how satisfied they are, we have to come back to the base level descriptors in terms of where are we organizationally, or what are the change management issues that we're facing to use these technologies. So we've seen that executives lack an understanding of supply chain, we can't get to data, we're operating in silos, and often reactive. So with that, Constance, let's go into, well, are supply chain centers of excellence helping? And if we go to slide 61, what we see is about 48% of the companies in this particular survey said, yes, they have a supply chain center of excellence. But the effectiveness of the supply chain center of excellence, we will typically get on this question somewhere between 40% to 61% effective. In fact, this survey shows that the people in this particular demographic survey were actually more positive about their supply chain center of excellence than what we've gotten in prior surveys over the last 6 months. And when we ask in terms of how well they've defined the center of excellence, we see on the next slide, slide 62, that the primary functions of the supply chain center of excellence are a definition of best practices for process, definition of supply chain metrics, and also clarity of the supply chain strategy. And one of the issues that I get into when I go work with companies and I try to help them with the understanding of supply chain processes is that often these new forms of analytics aren't evolution or continuous iteration of processes, but they're disruptive. And they're not just looking at inside out, but they're looking at outside in processes. And so one of the issues that supply chain centers of excellence have is the fact that their mental models are programmed for iterative continuous improvement, not really being able to grasp some of the power of new forms of analytics. And the other thing that is a struggle that many of the companies that I work with is the functions and the definition of functional versus corporate metrics and the tie to the financials. But when we look at the greatest gap in the center of excellence, which is on slide 63, what we see is that the ability to define metrics is a very large gap, and the ability to really get at which metrics matter. And of course, those that know me know I have a lot of passion for what that is, because that's what I'm in the middle of writing a book about. And we're in the middle of doing a pretty big study with Arizona State University, where we're taking the database that we've been building and we're looking at the correlations, the supply chain financial ratios for both balance, or the tie to market capitalization and free cash flow, and also looking at resiliency, which is how reliable is the supply chain in delivering operating margin and inventory turns. It's quite an exciting project, and what we're going to be doing is a series of webinars on that particular research over the course of the next couple of months. I encourage people to watch our webinar schedule and to dial back in with us. So now let's turn to, okay, we understand the challenges, we understand the organization. Now let's look at IT systems and spending. Where are we? Well, on slide 65, you can see that we've got a lot of stuff. You know, while we went out and we said that we were going to have one throat to choke and we were going to buy solutions from one vendor, that hasn't been real world. In fact, we see that most people in all these boxes have more than one system. And in fact, some even have 3 systems. You know, we've gone through mergers and acquisitions, and perhaps we've got different divisions. So the IT group is struggling with heterogeneous environments and the ability to keep systems going. And the budgets are being cut, and some of the maintenance costs are going up. And so there's a tightening of IT spending and a shift of spending to the line of business leader. Now, when we look at the greatest gaps, so we ask the supply chain leader, tell us what's working and tell us where your satisfaction is. So in terms of importance, you can see that ERP, order management, demand planning, production planning, these are very important applications. And these are the ones that have gaps. So the way to read this chart is that the blue bars are importance and the green bars are satisfaction, and the gaps are at the bottom. And so Heather, who actually codes this, will actually rank them based upon the degree of the gap. So, you know, lots of questions about demand planning, lots of questions about how do I make order management smoother. And production planning has been an ongoing issue. It's of all of our applications, the one that historically has had some problematic areas because it's so industry specific. Now, you know, we've introduced the cloud and we've introduced in-memory processing, and that brings new capability for concurrent analytics. And so when we look at, you know, the use of the cloud on slide 67, what we find that 7% use cloud-based delivery for at least one of their current systems, and 17% are using business process outsourcing for at least one of their systems. So you might say, well, what kind of systems are these? And what we find is that in the cloud-based delivery, that's often either sales and operations planning or perhaps what-if analysis or perhaps visibility, but it's typically a layer that is allowing cross-functional processes or visibility. Now, in terms of business process outsourcing, what we see here is a lot of it is outsourcing of ERP or transactional systems or perhaps reporting, and less about planning. We haven't really seen the evolution of business process outsourcing yet in the planning area to the degree that it could happen. So when we look at cloud-based delivery on the next slide, and we say, well, where are people actually working on cloud-based delivery? A lot of it is happening in the tactical planning horizon around tactical supply planning and demand planning. And again, a lot of that is tied into sales and operations planning. And the cloud-based delivery is helping with multiple S&OP processes. It's actually very interesting for me to watch in terms of the proliferation of S&OP processes and the ability to do sales and operations planning with suppliers, with customers, and to be able to look at the management of other and multiple S&OP systems. And then we see in some of our revenue management areas, price management has traditionally been a strong cloud-based area, and the evolution of the application for cloud. Now, when we look for business process outsourcing, you know, of course we get the outsourcing for 3PLs, the warehouse management, the transportation management, but also enterprise resource planning. And so one of the things that we see in the study is actually the evolution of the processes, particularly with the 3PLs, to support the supply chain and the outsourcing of logistics. Now, on the next slide, you know, the good news for the technology vendors in the crowd is on slide 70, when we ask what is the expected change in supply chain technology spending in 2014, you can see that 55% of the audience said that they plan to increase spending, 31% said to stay the same, and 10% said that it would decrease, and 3% said it didn't know. So on this particular survey, you know, supply chain is actually increasing in terms of interest in planned spending. And the most common areas for the increased spending are supply chain planning and execution, and business analytics and reporting. And so when I look at the inquiries that I'm getting, a lot of it is around how do I do demand planning differently? How do I manage analytics? How do I actually use some of the new forms of maybe it's Internet of Things, or maybe it's RFID for cold chain, or perhaps it's, demand sensing. But it's how do I start to bring new forms of real-time data into these traditional systems to be able to see data more holistically, to visualize data, and to be able to increase the effectivity of these particular systems. So with Constance, I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions at this point in time. Any questions from the audience?
We do, actually, Laura. Pradeep has a question. How much of this is IT problem rather than flawed business practices?
Well, I think that's a wonderful question, Constance. A lot of times I'll go into clients and I find that because many people have forgotten the basics of planning, or because we've got consultants that have never been trained on the basics of planning, that we will often be asked to, do a white sheet of paper. And because people don't know planning, or because they don't know the basics of supply chain, they'll try to automate their old systems versus looking at how do they really use new forms of analytics. And I think that's particularly problematic with, the great opportunities we have in newer forms of analytics that are not well understood. And so I think it requires a more discovery of short-term learning, actually testing these new forms of analytics, experiential learning, and then being able to look at the processes, because I think we're at a disruptive point with the processes where new forms of analytics are coming along and we can really use them differently in ways that we hadn't thought of before. So it's a great question. Thank you very much. Other questions?
Right now, Laura, we don't, but I remind the audience out there that if you have a question for Laura, please chat it in the Q&A section. We do have some time, and we'd love to hear from you.
Okay.
You know what? We got another question.
Awesome.
How about this? Given the satisfaction gap with planning processes and systems, why aren't we seeing the interest and openness to BPO and planning, where providers may be able to bring process people and tech best practices?
Well, we didn't test for that in the study, but I'll tell you my experience in working with clients. I think one of the things is that we have really not packaged business process outsourcing well enough that people can understand it's an option. And that requires really making it easy for people, particularly around global deployments. As many people know, we do a lot of surveys around talent, and we're having talent gaps in areas like South America and Asia. We've got a tremendous talent gap, and so we might think, well, business process outsourcing would be a great opportunity for that, but we don't have good packaged options for that in terms of centers that have language speaking capabilities of the regions and analytics that make that easily deployed. The second issue is that many times companies are worried about domain expertise for the interpretation of the data. And the third issue is that, they feel like it's so central to kind of the central nervous system, they want to hold it in-house. So I think those are the issues. So if there's someone that's thinking about, entering the market with a business process outsourcing option, I'd love to help you package it so that we can make it easier to use and deployable. I hope that helps, Constance.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. A couple more came in.
Okay.
So we have actually two folks asking, can you give a quick example of these new forms of analytics? Oh,
I'm so glad somebody asked about that, right? So We've got a couple of different trends that are happening in analytics, and we're actually doing a series of calls with what we call the Shaman Circle, where line of business users can get together and talk about analytics. We did our last call on new forms of analytics last month, and we're doing our current call this month on what we call cool technologies, which a lot of the cool technologies are analytics. And so I would say that, what excites me are analytics in 5 areas. One is visualization, which combines the ability to quickly see data, which includes dashboards, maps, but also looks at predictive analytics as part of that visualization layer. Very cool stuff. Second thing is unstructured text mining and the ability to sense off of structured and unstructured data through the evolution of listening post, or the ability to actually use unstructured data, which we've not had a lot of usage of unstructured data in the supply chain, but this might be warranty data, it might be quality data, it might be social data, it could be call center data, so that kind of analytics. The third is analytics of sensors. So digital manufacturing, the use of sensors on the production floor, and the combination with the Internet of Things to be able to look at serial data, either cold chain or manufacturing data or RFID data, where we're dealing with a lot of inputs from the Internet of Things, and it allows us to use real-time data in new and different forms. The fourth are cognitive learning engines, which allow us to take optimization and learning engines into artificial intelligence. And I think we're about 5 years away from supply chains that test and learn and give us, the best output based upon, learning systems, which I find extremely exciting. And then I think, the ability to better use sensing. Traditional supply chains respond, and we've seen the evolution of demand sensing, but we're also seeing the evolution of supplier sensing for supplier risk management, or sensing at the shelf, or sensing in the trucks. And so the evolutions of analytics that allow us to sense and then test and learn. So thank you for the question, because it's a tremendous opportunity to talk about some of those new technologies. Constance, you said you had another question?
Yes, and we'll be continuing that conversation on new forms of analytics. Our mini podcast series on Great Talk with Supply Chain Insights, we will be hosting that series and releasing it at the end of the month. So stay tuned for that. That will be found on our website. So a couple more questions. Big active group here. I love it. Lora, what do you think supply chain planning vendors should be doing better?
Well, it depends upon the vendor. But I have some vendors that have great applications that people don't understand, and they haven't really worked on how do people implement those processes well. What I find is that often the consultants will go into a client site and not be able to really combat the fact that people want to automate old systems and don't really understand the language of planning. So it's packaging, first of all, and second, really helping line of business teams understand how to implement planning systems. I found that we've lost a lot of the basics of planning, and I think that vendors assume too much on implementations. The second thing is, vendors that have worked on kind of the first generation of analytics, I think that we are at a tipping point for the redefinition of planning systems with new forms of analytics, whether it's visualization or learning systems or the ability to combine unstructured and structured data. I think it opens up a whole new area of differentiation for us to start to really peel back the traditional advanced planning system layer that was defined in the 1990s, back when we were talking about 32-bit to 64-bit architectures, and look at what could those planning systems be now that we have non-relational databases, and we've got, in-memory processing, and we've got new forms of analytics. I think the market is really poised for the next generation of planning. And I think what we've got to do is, really focus our R&D budget, just not on the next user enhancement, because, as Henry Ford said, if I asked the guys what kind of car they wanted, they would probably tell me a faster horse. I think that a lot of the planning vendors are in that vicious cycle of, maintenance money is paid, they ask the users what they want, the users see what they understand, and the planning software company is not able to take advantage of these great new forms of analytics. The third thing is, I think the ability to use the cloud. We have a lot of opportunities in global supply chains for deployment of cloud-based computing to really make supply chain easier, whether it's in business networks for, the automation of the extended supply chain, which I think we're right on the cusp of that market really changing, or whether it's in these horizontal processes, to be able to package to use the cloud. Not necessarily in the systems of record, which are the traditional tactical planning processes, but in the systems of differentiation, which allow us to really drive those horizontal processes in the business networks. I hope that helps. Other questions?
Yes. So Laura, to piggyback on that, Mark has a question. Do you expect IT spending to change drastically in the categories if we fast forward 2 to 3 years?
I think that this market is stalled because of the lack of innovation. I think we've not given the buyer enough to get excited about. I think that we have the opportunity now in the redefinition of planning to reignite this market. And I think if we could reignite the market, that it isn't a question of IT spending because the business value would be there. I think today we have so many planning systems that didn't necessarily deliver on the promise, and people are very frustrated with it. And so it's really put us into this area of disillusionment, and I think we haven't given them enough reason to buy. But the importance of supply chains is increasing. We can clearly see that, the business level pain is there. But I think we've really got to question our traditional paradigms and think about how do we bring differentiated solutions to the market. Other questions, Constance?
Great. Right now there's a bit of a slowdown, so
okay.
Maybe we wanted to continue with a couple of slides, and
yeah,
I encourage the audience out there to keep coming in.
Okay, so let's continue with this particular chart. If we look at this chart, one of the things we see on this particular chart is this evolution of big data concepts. And a lot of, companies I work with are intrigued with this concept, big data, but I would caution vendors to not just pepper their slides with big data because that's a turnoff, but to really talk about, what is the opportunity here? And I don't think we have a big data opportunity in supply chain with the size of the data. In fact, I define big data as a petabyte of data, and most of us are not dealing with a petabyte of data. But where we have the big data opportunity, I think, is with a variety of data, structured and unstructured data, and in this form of analytics, and the ability to really drive that particular engagement higher. The number one unmet demand that I have in working with clients is on visualization, the ability to see, whether it's to see into the network with different forms of supply chain visibility, or the ability to visualize alerts, or the ability to visualize maps, or to visualize outages. It's the ability to bring new forms of visualization to market. And I think that this area around big data, where people are really looking at the increase, is around that particular gap in the supply chain. Unfortunately, what we have are segmented systems, and we don't have a lot of good visibility and visualization in the supply chain. And so I think that that big data area is an opportunity for us to really think about, and that is actually an area where we'll be doing quite a bit of research in the upcoming months as we get ready for our global summit around, well, where is the opportunity in analytics and big data and visualization and Internet of Things, and how can we imagine the supply chain of the future? I also think that as we look at this slide, this slide is biased by the fact that, supply chain leaders filled it out. And so, of course, planning and execution, because a lot of the line of business budget money is going into this, and about 40% of planning and execution is actually funded directly out of the line of business budget right now. But look at some of the reach into marketing and sales from the supply chain centers. And so what we see is that, supply chain just isn't the center of the organization anymore, but we're actually starting to get applications that stretch across sales and marketing, whether it's, the automation of sales account teams in CPG, or we're looking at digital path to purchase in CPG, or we're looking at, how do we automate the channel in discrete and high-tech and electronics. So, we can't just think functionally anymore, but we've really got to think about, the end-to-end and cross-functional processes. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank the people that have filled out the surveys. This particular deck will be available for everyone to look at. However, my takeaways from these studies are that, investments in supply chain are increasing. But if we look at corporate performance, which what we're doing is we're actually mining the supply chain financial ratio for all publicly held companies for the period of 2006 to 2013, what we see is 9 out of 10 companies are really unclear on their planning architectures and definitions of common terms like integration, visibility, and analytics. And so one of the things we've really got to do is really get clear on our terms and what do these things mean and how do we really get at it. And often the companies are turning to their strategic vendor or their ERP vendor for help, and typically these companies offer systems of record but not really systems of differentiation for deeper and more responsive insights and the ability to do what-if analysis. In prior studies, we've seen about 8% of companies have sufficient what-if analysis, and most companies are really struggling between the tension of systems of record versus systems of differentiation. And where this is really of great concern are where we have very large global, and perhaps they're conglomerates, where we've got a lot of different kinds of users. We've got the casual user that just needs to view. We've got the person that's really deep into optimization, and we've got the spectrum in between. And we need to be able to do a lot of what-if analysis. We need to do a lot of visibility. But people are thinking, that everything has to write and everything has to move through one system. And the ability to have a system of record which can span the global supply chain and then to be able to bolt on systems of differentiation allow us to really grasp the concepts that are happening on new forms of analytics, to trial them, to experiment, and to build the muscle at the core and innovation at the edge that so many supply chain leaders talk about. And then finally, my caution is that a lot of people say that we're building end-to-end value chains, but really where people are spending money is the enterprise automation. And we're automating enterprise processes, although they're slow. But, we're really not thinking about what these processes could be with new forms of analytics. And most of the focus and spending is on transactional automation, not necessarily planning. So what I would challenge business leaders to do is to get really clear on new forms of analytics. Invite vendors in that do new forms of analytics and really think about how we can use new forms of analytics to our advantage and how we use the existing systems or system of record to be able to experiment at the edge. And the ability to use what we have today better. Often I go into companies and they say they've got these great planning systems and they're integrated, and I'll do surveys with the company, and I find that almost all companies are really using spreadsheets. And I think there are 3 reasons why that happens. One is I don't think people are clear that we can't really model the supply chain on a spreadsheet very effectively. With increased demand and supply probability, the spreadsheet is just really inadequate to do the modeling. But the second thing is the user interface of an Excel spreadsheet is pretty easy. People know how to do it, and it's pretty straightforward. And so I think that planning systems need to continually evolve that user interface so that it's easier to use. And the third is I think we just haven't worked on the processes that make it easy and make the reward system for use of the system. I think that we too easily let people off the hook not to use their optimization engines, and we encourage people to touch data. When new forms of analytics, we don't necessarily have to. So those are my takes. I'm glad to see the spending and supply chain planning increasing. I'm glad to see the increase in analytics, and I think that there's great opportunity that can be had here. Constance, other questions?
Yep, we have a couple coming in. So one is on forecasting and demand planning. What are the 2 to 3 reasons why companies continue to struggle with forecasting and demand planning? Is it process-related, technology, combination of both? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the term forecasting is problematic because it means at least 5 different things in a company. You know, there's financial forecasting, there's marketing forecasting, there's sales forecasting, there's budget forecasting, and then there's supply chain forecasting. And so I don't think people are clear on the differences and the uses and how they come together in different processes. So that's number one. And so people will say the term forecasting, but they'll talk really at each other. So the conversation isn't really a conversation. They'll use the same term, but it means very different things in conversations. And so the ability to do demand planning, which is, you know, to be able to derive patterns out of history or to be able to derive patterns out of market data, is not something that a lot of people understand because they're sort of blinded by their own definitions of forecasting. And the demand planning group often reports into a group that is biased. So whether they report to sales, which typically tends to be the most biased group, or marketing, which is the second most biased group, that particular forecast will carry bias and sometimes is not treated as seriously as perhaps it should be. But the third and one of, I think, the biggest issues with demand planning is that we do not have career paths for demand planners. They'll come in, they'll not necessarily get the adequate training, they'll move jobs, and so it takes a long time for a demand planner to really get good at their job. And our career paths turn those planners over very frequently at low levels, and we don't allow the demand planning organization to sort of grow up and develop kind of that core competency. I hope that helps.
Okay. Another process question. So Scott, wanted to get your thoughts on S&OP. Specifically, is there still a need for aggregated S&OP planning, or must these activities go to the detailed level? Is it okay to plan high-level S&OP and then later plan at SKU level using supply chain planning, or must S&OP have integrated detailed SCP planning at the SKU level?
I think the answer to this question is what is needed to have a feasible plan. The first step in S&OP, sales and operations planning, is the ability to model to have a feasible plan. And different companies have different kind of drivers around the feasible plan. If you're in a very tightly constrained environment, you're going to need a lower level of planning than if you are not in a constrained environment. So one of the things that I think we don't always ask ourselves is, what does the business need? So the first question is, what level of planning do I need to have a feasible plan? What are the constraints? What are the mix issues? And what drives that level to be able to have a feasible plan? After I can develop the feasible plan in stage 1 of the S&OP process, then I can go on and I can match demand and supply, and then I can layer on the profitability analysis. But I've got to start with a feasible plan. So the answer to the question is, what does it require in that organization to have a feasible plan? And it's a tactical process looking out over 12 to 18 months. It's not a short-term process. And how do I tie that tactical process into execution? And I think those 2 dimensions people get tripped up on because they don't ask themselves hard enough questions on what's a feasible plan, and they don't ask themselves hard enough questions about how do I take supply chain planning to execution.
Okay. Another one coming in, Laura. What are your thoughts on supplier-manufacturer collaboration in the system? Do you think this could work, and how do you think this could impact analytics?
Supplier manufacturing and the collaboration in the systems, you know, what we're seeing is the evolution of business networks. I talked about about 7% of the flows are coming through business networks. And this is something that I'm actually doing quite a bit of research on, and in our newsletter we'll have a series of reports that will actually look at the evolution of business networks. And I'm extremely excited to see the evolution of very feasible platforms that allow one-to-many and many-to-many architectures that not only allows the connectivity but also allows the enablement of business process and sharing of data and perhaps even benchmark data in new ways. And so look for that report in our newsletter. It's quite an exciting area. We've got a report that looks at where are we on the business networks, and then we also have a report that actually showcases the capabilities of business networks. They're very differentiated both by type of process, by community, by analytics, and also that connectivity layer. But I'm extremely excited about the interface and the promise of the connectivity between supplier and manufacturer.
Okay. Last one, Laura. You mentioned that software vendors have done a poor job delivering on promised value, and this person agrees. But what do they really need to do to help clients get the value that was promised?
Well, I think it's a lot like, buying a car, right? We're buying supply chain planning, which has a lot of engines in it. And it's, when I walk out of a car showroom, I just don't expect that I'll never see my dealer again, right? I get a book that tells me, when to get an oil change, and, the light on my dash says it's time to take it to my dealer, right? We haven't really built these systems that allow us to have continuity of the interface about engine tune-up, engine refinement, audits, and I think the traditional license maintenance kind of buying patterns don't enable us to have long-term relationships so that we can get tune-ups and we can be able to get that ongoing continuity. The second thing is, because of how licensed software evolved, the ability to do an upgrade is an opportunity cost for the organization. And so one of the things I really love about software as a service is the continuity and the ability to advance the supply chain software without having that kind of disruption and distraction. So the ability for cloud-based vendors to make that seamless, I think, is a great opportunity so we don't get stagnant on old software. The third is that, I think that, comes down to let's get clear on what this software can do, and the initial implementation is so important. A lot of times people don't ask hard enough questions about, are we just automating old processes, or are we taking full advantage of new forms of analytics? And then when we implement, we should let planners plan. So many companies confuse the urgent and the important. They'll put in a lot of planning tools, but they won't give the planners time to plan. So building that core capability for planners to plan.
Okay, Laura, we have an active group, so I have a couple more questions for you.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, this is great. So going back to S&OP, which industry does the best S&OP planning? So if they're looking for a benchmark, which companies would you showcase as best practices?
So as an industry, consumer electronics does the best job on S&OP. However, I would say that there are companies within consumer packaged goods that do a good job on S&OP. However, they tend to be more mid-market companies that have really focused on it, as a differentiator. If the person asks me the question, I'll give specific companies to them, but I don't want to just broad brush and, give the company names out broadly. But I'd be glad to answer that one-on-one.
Okay, fair enough. So Pat has a question. You talk about the need to change mental mindsets in the organization.
Yes.
That could imply risk-taking. Can you elaborate on your viewpoint of changing mental models based on your experience?
Yeah, I think it takes courage. I often think about the guy who's, sky jumping, right? And it takes courage. You've got to really feel like you've got that parachute. And so you've got to have a supportive leadership team. And you've got to test and learn from the systems before you really implement them. And so one of the mental models I think we had on transactional systems was big deployment, continuous improvement, and evolve over time. And one of the things I think we've got to challenge ourselves on, and we've actually got a couple of great podcasts of leaders that have done some great things with new forms of predictive analytics, is we've got to test things and really understand how they work and then start to put them into the process flows and refine them. And the analytics projects are smaller projects, and we may not know what that outcome is going to be. It's almost like R&D with innovation and analytics. And maybe your organization isn't a risk taker, or maybe you don't have the courage to jump out of a plane, but I really feel that the new forms of analytics offer so much promise to answer questions we don't know to ask, to visualize unnatural inferences, to be able to look at cognitive learning and artificial intelligence, and we're right at the cusp. So even if you're not a risk taker, be a fast follower because it's of such great importance. And Constance, I think that's a great lead-in for us to go to our next slide, which really talks about our event. So let's talk just a minute about that before people leave the phone.
Sure.
We're planning an event in September. We've got Lora Cecere, who's actually worked with the Obama administration on the economic revitalization of the U.S. economy, and she's going to be talking about the global ups and downs of the global economy, really preparing the world for what's going to happen. But also the theme of our conference is Imagine, and it's got 5 themes that run through it. One is, let's imagine what software could be. Let's imagine what we could do with organizational systems. Let's imagine if we could change the physics of the supply chain with digital manufacturing and robotics. And let's imagine what we could do if we could use collaborative networks, either with collaborative economy and the use of social data, or the sharing of networks and redefining of the supply base. Let's imagine. Let's leave ourselves open for new mental models. And so even if you're not the person that's a risk taker in the organization, or you think your organization's not a risk taker, come to the conference and hear some of the things that are happening, because I think you'll find it pretty exciting. What do you think, Constance?
I'm excited as well. It is our second event. The first one was fantastic. We have some great video footage of our sessions from last year on the website Supply Chain Insights Global Summit, so please check them out, and I encourage the folks to register because it will sell out soon.
Yeah, in fact, I think we had 15 sign-ups last week, and there's only 180 seats. So, you know, a lot of time between now and September, but I think it's going to fill up fast. And then we also have our training series where if people can't go to a conference, but perhaps they have a need for training to understand case studies for new forms of analytics, or some of the work we've been doing on performance metrics and the tie of functional metrics to corporate metrics, or the ability to change mental models to think outside in. These are our training dates. It's a 2-day training class. It's structured to be very experiential so that people leave with their own roadmaps. And then finally, I love having people join us today on our webinar. We apologize that our webinar last month didn't work out because, you know, Cisco had a failure with the ice storms and we couldn't actually get it to work, but Cisco apologizes, and so we have a couple of webinars coming up, and we'd encourage people to sign up for those as well as to sign up for our newsletter. So with that, Constance, I think we can sign out. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Laura, for sharing your thoughts on Voice of the Supply Chain. I chatted out a couple of links throughout the hour. You can take a look at our research report as well as the deck from today's webinar on our website, supplychaininsights.com, and we will have this recording on demand available very shortly on our website as well. Thank you very much. We'll see you April 10th for Risk Management, our next webinar in the series. You have a great day.